walking on the sidewalk, they see up ahead there's all this scaffolding that's been built up right over the sidewalk. There's some sort of construction happening on a building that lined the sidewalk, and there was a platform that was built maybe 8 to 10 feet above the sidewalk, this scaffolding, so that workers could stand on this platform and do construction. And so pedestrians, like Marilyn and Jim, if they wanted to walk on the sidewalk, they would have to walk under the scaffolding. Like the sidewalk continues unobstructed right underneath. The scaffolding is intentionally built to allow for this tunnel for pedestrians to walk. Like, this is not a big deal. It's very common in cities. And so Marilyn and Jim, they walk underneath the scaffolding, and they're not thinking anything of this. This is completely ordinary. There's other people also walking under the scaffolding. It's all good. But at some point, Jim trips while they're under the scaffolding. And where he lands is where there's a couple pieces of metal kind of poking up out of the ground, some metal tubing. It was kind of obvious and people avoided it. But he's falling, he can't avoid it, and he lands with his neck striking basically this metal tube poking up out of the ground. And so Jim, he hits the ground and the tube cuts his neck wide open. And so suddenly Jim is literally gushing blood all over the sidewalk. And it happens so completely suddenly that Marilyn, she saw her husband trip and she's kind of getting him to stand up. And as she's doing that, she's seeing all this blood pooling everywhere. And she just freezes. She has no idea what's happened. Like, what's going on with Jim? Why is he bleeding? And she starts screaming for help. And there are these two guys. There's nobody else inside the tunnel with them, but there are these two men who don't know each other. They're just strangers out on the street. They hear Marilyn screaming for help, pointing at her husband who's still laying on the ground. And these two guys come running over to her and they're kind of assessing the situation. And they see Jim kind of grabbing at his neck as blood is pouring out of him. And one of the men pulls out his phone and calls 911. So he starts talking to first responders. And the other man, he got down next to Jim. He pulled the scarf off from around his neck and he cradled Jim's head and he wrapped the scarf around Jim's neck and he applied pressure to Jim's neck. And very calmly, he told Jim, "It's okay, we're stopping the bleeding, paramedics are on their way." He tells Marilyn, "It's okay, I've got your husband, you stay calm, everything's gonna be fine." And so Marilyn, who again is just kind of in a panic here, this happens so suddenly, she immediately calmed down because she can tell clearly this second man, the guy holding her husband's head and applying pressure, he's gotta be a doctor or at a minimum in the medical field because this guy has just a commanding presence, a very calming presence, and knows what he's doing. And so to Marilyn's great relief, the man on the ground holding her husband's head and the man who had called 911, they stayed with her and Jim all the way until the paramedics arrived, which was only a couple of minutes later. And then after Jim was lifted up by paramedics and put into the back of the ambulance, Marilyn was told, "Hey, get in, you're coming with him." And as she's climbing into the ambulance, she turns and specifically asks the man who was kind of all over it, who was actually handling Jim and actually holding his head and applying pressure, she said, "What's your name?" And the man looked at her and he just said, "My name's John. Everything is fine. Your husband's gonna be okay. Now go." And so Marilyn just felt so reassured by this guy and she said, "Thank you so much." She hops in the ambulance, the door's shut, and they take off to the hospital. The following day, Marilyn was in her husband's hospital room, feeling very grateful that Jim was clearly going to survive here. So ultimately, he had broken a finger and also needed 10 stitches to his neck to close the wound. But from what the doctors told them, basically the cut to his neck, had it been maybe an eighth of an inch deeper, it almost certainly would have severed his main artery, and then very likely he would have bled to death right there on the sidewalk before paramedics arrived. So this was a very close call. But even without that deep of a penetration, the wound he sustained was still life-threatening. And the doctors told them that, because of the quick action of John and the other man who called 911, that very likely contributed to stabilizing him enough that he was able to get to the hospital and be saved. And so Marilyn and Jim, they can't believe this has happened, but they're so grateful to the medical team and also to the two men from yesterday, who they don't even know who they are. But Marilyn is determined that she needs to find these two men, John and the other guy, and thank them. But she's realizing she really doesn't have a way to contact them. I mean, this all happened so quickly, and all she knows is one guy is named John, and she didn't even have the other guy's name. But luckily, the following day, when Marilyn and Jim were back at their hotel, they got a call from the front desk saying that they had a visitor. And it would turn out it was the man who had called 911. He had been really concerned about Jim and Marilyn and wanted to figure out if they were okay, and he had discovered where they were staying, and so he had come to see them. And so Marilyn and Jim, they come down and they're so thankful, and they come to find out this guy is actually the owner of PJ O'Brien's pub where they had gone to eat on the night Jim had fallen. And she's just saying, thank you so much. Without you, I don't know what would have happened. And then also Marilyn's like, do you know the other guy, John, the one who actually was applying pressure to Jim's neck because he also played a huge role in saving Jim's life. And the owner of the pub, he sort of looked back at Marilyn with a smile on his face, and he's like, well, I don't know him personally. We just happened to be walking down the street when you called out for help. But, I know who John is. Lots of people know who John is. In fact, honestly, you probably know who John is. Because it would turn out John was not a doctor, the way Marilyn assumed he was, based on how easily he stepped into the fray of this medical crisis and knew what to do and put pressure on Jim's neck and seemed so calm. None of that had to do with medical training. He was not medically trained. Instead, John has this skill. He's this really charismatic, really commanding presence where every time he's in a room, people just look to him and think, oh, he's got to be in charge, because he's just got this way about him, this X factor. And he carries that X factor on screen. Every role this guy plays in movies and TV shows, he is the leader. He is in charge, and it's so effortless because that's kind of his thing. And so from that day forward, Marilyn and Jim had a brand new favorite actor, John Malkovich, the multi-time award-winning actor who literally saved Jim's life. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have hundreds of videos for you to binge right now. But if you're looking for a recommendation from me of that one video that's worth your time, well, it's this one right here. So give it a watch. All right, until next time, see ya. Today, I'm going to tell you two stories. The first story is about this woman in China who goes on a hike into this beautiful forest, and it quickly spirals into a complete nightmare. And the second story is about this small village in Taiwan where this very strange event happens. And it spooks the villagers so badly that the Taiwanese government actually investigated. And what they discovered defies any logical explanation. But before we get into those stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place, because that's all we do, and we upload once a week. So if that's of interest to you, on the like button's birthday, offer to bring the cake. But when you sing them happy birthday, make sure you replace the candles with TNT. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's stories. Early on the morning of February 16th, 2020, a 39-year-old woman named Faye stepped out of a convenience store in a small village in China. She was wearing a bright red distinctive coat, and in her hands were a whole bunch of snacks that she had just purchased. So Faye had lived in this village her whole life. She was a very simple person, and she had a really specific daily schedule that she basically always adhered to. And it was, she would get up early, she would throw on her jacket, and she would head out to this convenience store, get some snacks, and then she would either go back home where she lived with her husband, or she would go to her parents' house or her sister's house to pay them a visit. And that was basically what she did every single day. And so this day had started exactly the same as every other day. And after she left the store and she began eating some snacks and, thinking about where she was going to go next, whether it was her house or a relative's house, she's walking down this road when suddenly she hears people calling out to her. And so she stops and she turns, and there are these 5 people that are clustered together standing at the top of this trailhead. So Faye's village was home to this beautiful hiking trail that started right where these people were standing. The trail went up this mountainside and up into this huge forest where there were all these ponds and waterfalls. I mean, it was strikingly beautiful. And that area, the forest with all the ponds, was called the 18 Ponds of the Dragon King. It was called that because there were literally 18 ponds sort of scattered throughout this forest. And then also the village where Faye lived that was right up against it, well, it meant Dragon King in Chinese. But even though Faye had grown up here, she had never once gone on that hiking trail. She had heard about it, and loads of her friends and family had all been up there and talked about its striking beauty. But Faye, she had always stayed away. But there was actually a pretty good reason for that. So Faye, when she was younger, she had this tumor. And in order to get rid of it, she had to take all this medication that was pretty physically harmful and left her with some pretty serious long-term effects. And even though the tumor, did go away and she recovered, that process of recovering and taking all those medications and going to the doctor, it sort of instilled in her this mentality that she was frail and delicate and that she shouldn't take any chances and risk getting hurt. And so she really never did anything that was even remotely risky or even perceived to be risky. Like, for example, hiking up into the mountains. Too risky for her, and so she avoided it. And instead, she kind of developed this really simple, safe daily routine of getting snacks and visiting family, and that's all she ever did. And while in some ways this did, keep Faye safe, it also made her very isolated and lonely. She didn't really have any friends or do anything. She was just kind of stuck in her ways. And so Faye is on this road, and these villagers, these 5 villagers over at the trailhead, have just deliberately called to her by name. They're saying, "Hey, Faye, over here." And Faye's turned, and she's looking at them, and they're clearly getting ready to go hike up into the 18 ponds of the Dragon King. And they tell her, "Hey, come with us, come hiking with us, come check it out." And for Faye, this was so unusual. This was not even remotely how her life went, that there was something in her that for a second just felt really excited. I mean, she did sort of rely on her schedule and her discipline of doing the same thing every day. It kept her safe. But this sudden invitation from these people, these villagers, it just felt like, why not? Why not do something different for once? And she's also thinking, how dangerous can it be? I'm with other people. They seem really competent. Maybe this is a good idea. Maybe I'll just go with them. What the heck? See what happens. And so Faye found herself just sort of drifting over to these very friendly 5 people and saying, "You know what? What the heck? Yeah, I'll come with you. I've never been up there. I'm sure it's great. Let's go." And so sure enough, Faye and her newfound 5 friends from the village, they begin hiking up this trail. And over the next couple of hours, Faye is seeing a beautiful landscape that she was so close to her whole life that now she's seeing for the first time. And it's revelatory. She can't believe that she's lived this close to this majesty for so long and she's never seen it. This was a life-changing experience for her. And so her mood is just so good. And these 5 people are so wonderful, and they're all chattering and talking about their lives. And, Faye's opening up about hers and her health scares and all these different things. And eventually, they make their way into this forest, which is really dense, but they eventually reach one of these ponds, one of the 18 ponds, and it's got this huge clearing, and all the sunlight's pouring in, and there's a waterfall leading into the pond. It's truly stunningly beautiful. And Faye's friends, they all take a seat right on the shore of the pond, and they break out some snacks. And Faye, she sits down, she's got those snacks she bought from the convenience store, and they basically have a picnic right on the shore. And for Faye, it was this was the most amazing day, potentially, of her whole life. She had broken out of her comfort zone. She had met these wonderful people who were so inclusive. And here she is experiencing this unbelievable natural beauty. The day couldn't get any better. But as she was sitting there on the side of the pond, enjoying this beautiful scene, she started to feel really intensely fatigued. And at first she's thinking, oh, of course, I don't really get out much and exercise much, and I just hiked up this mountain into this forest. Of course I'm tired. But she felt herself kind of slumping back on the rock she was on and almost positioning herself like she might lay down and sleep. And then before long, it was like the world around her began getting hazy, and she could see her friends still talking, and they weren't really looking at her. They're just kind of enjoying their food. And then it was like Faye just could not keep her eyes open, and she put her head down, closed her eyes, and she fell asleep. When Faye woke up again, she was still laying in that same spot, but now it was dark. And also, her 5 friends were gone. She was all alone next to this pond in the middle of this forest. And for Faye, it was immediately this jolt of panic rocketed through her. She starts looking around for these, friends of hers. They've got to be here somewhere. They wouldn't just abandon her. They were so nice. How could this possibly be? but she's looking around and all she can see is just darkness. I mean, there's some moonlight coming through the clearing over the pond, but when she looked into the tree line, it was just all dark and there's no one. All she can hear is birds and insects, night sounds. And remember, Faye is not somebody who would ever find herself in this position. This is so far out of her comfort zone. Alone at night in this forest, in this austere environment, suddenly it felt very austere, and she's terrified. And at the same time, her mind starts telling her, oh my gosh, this whole thing was a trap. Those 5 people weren't my friends. They brought me up here. They tricked me. They drugged me, or maybe they've left and they're gonna come back and hurt me.